Hello, I'm Mike Graham with Midwestern Securities, and welcome to this episode of Banking on Growth. With us today is our friend Philip Smith from Garish, Smith & Tuck in Memphis, Tennessee. Philip, you and I have known each other for a few years now. We've got some mutual clients, and we've got a passion for working in the community bank space. I know a little bit about you, and I respect what I know about you. I would like for our podcast followers to know a lot more about you and your firm. Will you go ahead and share a little bit about yourself and your firm?
Yeah, happy to do that, Mike. And first of all, thanks for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate the opportunity to do that. We're kind of a unique animal. Our firm, Garish, Smith Tuck, is really two firms, a law firm and a separate consulting firm. We're based in Memphis, Tennessee, but we have a national practice. And even though everyone in the firm is a lawyer, everyone in the firm also has some other slight specialty. There's guys like me with MBAs, guys with tax backgrounds, some regulatory background. And so through the combination of those two firms, the only thing that we do is exclusively represent financial institutions all over the country. And so one day I could be in Seattle or in Peoria or Texas, so there's no rhyme or reason to it. And our firm was started 36 years ago in 1988. I started there in 1990, so I've been there 34 of those years. And so I spend most of my time traveling around the country, meeting with boards of directors. And certainly one of the hot topics that's being discussed a lot these days is strategic planning. And then within that, what's happening in the M&A environment and how does it impact the organization? So happy to answer whatever questions there might be.
Yeah. So we both love the community bank space. And we think that banking is an important part of global commerce, and it's an advantage to have a more competitive banking system and have more choices for the consumer. But there's some challenges out there right now. What do you think are the top 3 or 4 challenges facing community banks today?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting question. And I always sort of look at it, because I'm in the community bank space most specifically, are the challenges there really any different than the challenges broadly? And to some extent, they're really not, but they're exacerbated at a community bank. For example, the whole notion of the technology march in financial institutions. The way that we're transferring money is now all electronic or mostly electronic. How does a smaller bank really respond to that? How do they keep up with that? So that's certainly one. The second one is I'll call it an emerging issue, which is sort of a rebirth of regulatory issues, regulatory concerns. You know, one of the things we're telling our clients is, hey, if you're on an 18-month or 12-month exam cycle and you haven't had your current exam, your current one coming up is not going to be like your last one. People are finding the regulatory environment a little harsher, a little more focused. Even though the banks come into it, most of them with good asset quality, there are some hot topic issues, one-off issues that banks, particularly community banks, are being confronted with, whether that's CRA, fair housing issues, those kinds of things that are kind of catching them by surprise. And then, of course, for all of us, overall profitability, net interest margin is reduced. How do you make money? Well, in a community bank space, one of the big things banks always do is say, well, I supplement my interest income with appropriate sources of non-interest income. Now that's under attack, it seems like, so that you find a good product customers like, they're willing to pay for it, and then you have, Congress or someone else coming in and saying, well, wait a minute, maybe that's an unfair, deceptive way of creating funding, so you shouldn't do that. So, and I think all of those maybe that's my top 3, and then I think all of those lead Mike to this idea that just maintaining organizational relevance going forward. How do you do that as a smaller organization dealing with this next generation of customers and the like? So that's kind of where I see the difficulties and the challenges that lie.
Interesting. So you do a lot of business consulting on mergers and acquisitions and strategic alliances. What are you seeing as the primary drivers of these discussions happening in boardrooms currently?
Yeah, I think maybe I can give you sort of both sides, from a buy side and a sell side. From those organizations on the buy side, a lot of it is just this focus on scale, and do you actually create economies of scale in an acquisition? The idea is that, 1 + 1 should equal 3, because as I grow larger, I can spread my cost over a wide array of assets, and there's some truth to that. So from a buyer standpoint, it's the march towards scale. And certainly it's the emergence or moving into new markets. A lot of community banks particularly will simply say, I'm tapped out in my current market. We have all the market share we can get there. We have a known number of competitors and everyone's sort of divvied up the market where it is. So it's this idea if I want to grow, if I want to get more scale even, maybe I'm looking in new markets. And then when you do that, one of the questions is it cheaper to buy a bank or just simply branch into that? And sometimes it's actually more beneficial to acquire another bank in a new market. So I see that as one, too. And then just the push for greater improved metrics, improved profitability, improved earnings per share performance, return on equity, all should be appropriate from a buyer standpoint if you do the deal and structure it correctly. So that's kind of from the buy side. Then you say, well, what would make in the community bank sector banks want to sell? And I come to this as a guy in a firm that does a lot of community bank sales, but I think one of the reasons we do that is because we're staunch independent supporters. We don't want banks selling just to be selling. We hope community banks stay independent, and we try to help them shape that way. But one of the key things I see currently, Mike, is fear is one of the things, just absolute fear of the unknown. And part of that's brought on by many organizations themselves because they haven't adequately planned to maintain their independence. And what I mean by that is, if you say, well, why would a bank sell right now? I can tell you the answer of why they would sell is not a massive, massive premium, the largest premium they could ever get. It's something else, right? And so you ask what that is. Sometimes it's simply there's a lack of management succession, a lack of ownership succession, a lack of board succession going on. Or it's this fear that, wow, we realize now we should have done more earlier on technology. We feel we're too far behind. How do we climb that mountain now? And so maybe we don't want to spend all that time. Hey, can you just go find us a buyer? So I see sort of that playing into it as well. And then just the fear of the regulatory environment. Candidly, a lot of the boards I deal with have longevity in them. That's a nice way of saying it. And those older directors remember the last time they went through this, and it wasn't much fun. And they don't like being under the MOU and or the consent order. And so, boy, the first little indication of regulatory concern, and they're apt to say, you know what, let's just push our chips to the middle. Let's look and see if we can get a pretty good value now. So I sort of see that driving it on both sides of the aisle from buyers and sellers. And so, interestingly, it's still a pretty active market now. There's not zillions of deals being done, but there's still a pretty good number of them. It's just taking longer to get them done. So you don't see them all hitting, at the end of every quarter, you don't see 20 or 30 new deals announced. They're more piecemeal coming out.
Would you consider it a buyer's market if there are buyers with a strong enough capital position? Would you consider they have more leverage in this environment, or would you consider it a seller's market?
Yeah, I think where we are right now is a little bit of a transition period because I think it's growing into a buyer's market because some of the sellers that are coming forth are making that decision, say, well, great, I just want to sell now. And then you have these technical issues like adjusted other comprehensive income, posted on your balance sheet. And so what do you do about that? The buyer says, I would love to pay you 2 times book value. In fact, you're probably worth 2 times book value. However, I have to market your securities portfolio. You have a large loss. If you want to sell now, this is the maximum I can pay you with the adjustment, right? So the buyers often might say, look, here's the number I'm paying you, but I have to take this current accounting adjustment. So here's the actual number. So that sort of gives the buyer a benefit, in my opinion. But the key thing I always tell banks, and sometimes the sellers will ask the question exactly the way you did. Hey, is it a buyer's market? And I always fear that what they mean by that is, am I at a loss to negotiate very strongly? Do I have diminished capacity? And I always say, well, no, just because you're a smaller organization and you might sell to a bigger organization doesn't mean you lose your negotiating leverage. There's lots of ways you can negotiate various things. I've even had clients that might have a large AOCI and therefore a buyer's looking at them but wanting to discount it. And we're able to negotiate around that a bit, look at the duration in the investment portfolio, those kind of things. But currently, I would say it's true that we're growing into that buyer's market with the pressure on earnings for the sellers and this increasing regulatory burden that we're experiencing.
Good summary. I appreciate that, Philip. So, how can community banks proactively assess their organizational and financial health to determine if they should be looking at a strategic alliance or merger or acquisition?
I like that question because it sort of presupposes there should be some way to do that, right? And there is. And my commentary is that that type of analysis ought to be done yearly and ought to be done probably in conjunction with your annual strategic planning. I'm a big advocate of strategic planning for organizations of all sizes, whether you're 4 billion or 40 million. And I have the good fortune of doing a lot of planning across the country for banks of all different sizes. And no matter the organization, I always ask the strategic question, hey, let me play devil's advocate. Do you want to sell the bank? And often that leads into a discussion of, well, no, I don't think we want to. Why? Are you saying we should? No. But have you ever analyzed whether you ought to do that? And if you come back and say, well, no, we've analyzed it, we don't want to be a seller, great. Then should you be a buyer? Have you ever analyzed that? Well, we thought we were too small to buy somebody else. Well, there's always a bank smaller than you. Have you ever thought about that? So I think this decision making, this analysis of whether you ought to be in the game ought to be a subset of your overall strategic planning. It shouldn't be something you don't talk about. Or occasionally I will see banks that say, oh, we do yearly strategic planning and we go 2 days off site, but we don't want to talk about that. Instead, we've got a little subcommittee of the board and we'll talk about that in the parking lot after the board meeting, right? So I don't like that either. It ought to be something up front. It's just part of the growth initiatives or the long-term independence initiatives. So, again, as I stated, my supposition or my proposal is I hope banks remain independent, but the way to remain independent is to actively plan for that. And to do that every year, you have to assess what's the market like. Is now a good time or is now not a good time? Should we be a buyer or should we not? And in particular, the banks that want to be buyers, I even encounter this occasionally, Mike. A bank may ask me, they'll say, would you come out and talk to our board? We're looking at buying XYZ bank and we need some consultation on that, et cetera. I'll go out and look at that. We might run the financial analysis for them. And interestingly, I might come back and say, well, why are you thinking about buying this bank? It doesn't seem to make very good economic sense. Well, we want to improve earnings. And then I might say, well, as a counter to that, have you ever thought about just utilizing your capital to create your own market in your stock or buy back stock or something like that? And so sometimes the alternatives to an acquisition have often never been considered. But that's why I think within a strategic planning session is where you can really get to the heart of that discussion.
Yeah, that's really good. What percentage of community banks operate with that sort of intentionality and thoughtfulness about what's their vision look like and what's the best way to maximize their vision?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll halfway jokingly say, Mike, based on my over 30 years in the business, more and more every year are doing that, right? But at least that's my hope and expectation. But I think it's true that every year, because of the increased pressures, more and more, even small community banks are taking up the mantle of strategic planning, trying to determine what we're doing and how we're doing it. So I would say well over 50%, if not close to probably 80% of the banks in the country are doing formal strategic planning of some form or another and talking about those issues.
Well, that's excellent. That's great to hear. What specific benefits comes to community banks from M&A activity in terms of financial stability, long-term viability? What are you seeing?
It's interesting. One of the things people don't think about, or maybe the banks don't often think about, or it's never portrayed this way, at least in publications, is banks pursuing growth through M&A as an independent strategy in and of itself. We tend to think, oh, well, that bank is just there, just want to conquer the world. They're buying another bank. They're trying to line the insiders' pockets. Well, sometimes acquisition is the road to maintaining your independence. It's the road to scale. It's the road to greater technology investments. It's the road to increasing your legal lending limit to be a better asset in your community. So I think that point is often missed, that financial stability can be gained, not disrupted, through being an acquirer. And so if you look at it in that regard, I think it can be very helpful. Now, the buyers have to be smart in that. You don't want to just be growing for growing. And in fact, you put that back in the strategic planning context, I always tell banks that I think it's a mistake when I see banks in their strategic plan is to get to fill in the blank of some asset size within X number of years. And I say, well, why is that? Well, we want to get to 500 million in 3 years, or we want to get to 1.2 billion within 5 years. And I always say, well, why is that? I don't hear stockholders calling up and saying, hey, what's our asset size? That's not what they're concerned about. They want to know, how profitable are we? What's my dividends? And so I think the stability, the comfort of pursuing growth can be that way of creating financial stability. And of course, if you're on the other side as a seller, ultimately, what we're seeing now are more of these stock for stock deals. I hate to call them mergers of equals, but non-cash deals where the quote selling organization is seeking greater stability through a partnership with someone else, or even both banks are trying to create stability by partnering up. And that's sort of a relatively new and emerging trend, but we're seeing more of that.
Yeah, interesting. What strategic considerations should community banks take into account when exploring these M&A opportunities? Well,
of course, all of the financial metrics are there. Everyone knows that. Your investment banker will tell you that. You're looking at repayment of your book value dilution. You're looking at earnings per share accretion, market growth, those kind of things. And so we all know those. But I think if you're trying to look for what's that next level that really separates a deal, you start getting into some of those areas like, well, would merging two organizations create culture problems within the organization? What's going to be the customer experience of a greater combined organization? What's competition look like in the market if we move into that? And then I think particularly these days, one of the things I've been talking to buyers about, commercial bank buyers in particular, is if you're trying to compete to acquire selling organizations, we absolutely have to consider the impact that credit unions are having in the M&A environment. And the simple, blunt truth is that credit unions are winning the bids in a lot of cases. And you can get through all the technical issues about taxation and impact on CRA and all that. The simple truth is they're paying more. And so the selling boards of those organizations, in my opinion, sometimes kind of panic and think, wow, I've got to sell to the highest bidder, even if it's $1 more. And I hate that it's the credit union, but that's who I'm going to sell to. And so a little bit of that issue with dealing with credit unions and the competition for bidding. But I think all of the metrics still apply. But if I'm a commercial bank and I'm in a bid situation with another, and I feel like this is a pretty good target, there may be some credit unions involved, some investor groups. One of the things we're telling our clients that are bidders are, maybe you need to throw the old metrics of how you determine whether a deal was good out the window. So, for example, you normally would say, wait a minute, a 4.5-year repayment on book value dilution, I want that to be 1.5 or 2 years. Well, maybe, we're competing against a credit union that doesn't have to worry about book value per share dilution. So maybe we price it up a bit with an understanding we're just going to have to deal with a 4-year dilution to book value rather than a 2-year. So again, I think some of those metrics in terms of what we're focusing on are evolving, along with a greater focus on some of these soft issues like culture and customer experience.
Let's take this train of thought to the next question. We covered financial, we covered strategic and cultural. What about regulatory factors?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, there's always regulatory factors, new ones coming down the line every day. So, it's interesting to me. We still have these, I'll call them historical and candidly antiquated regulatory concerns like the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index. Anybody's been in the M&A environment has heard that. It's a fancy way of saying banks within a common market might not be able to combine at all. You may not be able to merge with the bank across the street, even if it's a great deal. You know why? It's deemed under this old test to be anti-competitive. So you have those kind of historical things to deal with from a regulatory standpoint. And then, of course, we now have the emerging sort of issues as well. And we are even seeing regulators take a different view when they're analyzing an application. And here's what I mean by that. You take a historical situation. Bank A and Bank B want to merge. They're both represented by sophisticated counsel. They negotiate a definitive agreement. Both sides agree that this is what they want to do. They sign it. We move forward, and a regulatory application is filed. Occasionally now the regulators are coming back and digging into the agreement, not just seeing if the deal makes sense legally and pro forma capital, but they're coming back and saying, hey, we've got a question about paragraph 4, subpart A. Why did the parties negotiate this? And by way of example, I'll give you one. Why did the parties pick a termination fee of X dollars? And of course, both parties, interestingly, there want to go to the regulators and go, why is that any of your business? We've agreed to this. And I had one of those situations a few years back where the regulator said, we think the breakup fee that's been negotiated is too large. And our comment was, yeah, but we both agree to that. Why does it matter? And they wanted to know why it was so large. And so we said, well, follow me on this. We want it to be as large as possible so that neither party will want to trigger it. We want to hold the deal together. And so those kind of regulatory concerns are out there. I think the pro forma capital often will be overlooked on the deal until you get to that regulatory point. But if you're taking two banks with marginal capital and putting them together, and the resulting financial institution is going to have 7% tier 1 capital, regulatory personnel are not going to like that. So we need a little pre-planning on the front end. And the result of that is, again, we don't want to be antagonistic with the regulators. We want to be collaborative. So we're beginning to see more and more deals. If you look at them and they have any little difference, nuance, maybe the pro forma capital won't be as strong as you might think, rather than going through the full negotiation process, signing an agreement, and then submitting it to the regulators and hoping they approve it, we're seeing more going to the regulators on the front end. Hey, we want to give you a heads up confidentially. These two banks were looking at each other. We may even have a draft agreement. What do you all think? I've had regulators ask us to submit a draft application, not a final one, but a draft one they can look at in draft and give us comments on. So again, I just think we have to recognize that regulatory process has become a little more involved, arguably a little more invasive, and extenuated on the time. So if two banks are negotiating, if they start talking today, right now, it would be tough to get that one done by the end of the year, just because of the regulatory process as well. So I think you have to anticipate, if you're looking at doing a deal, you're probably looking at, a easily 9 to 12 month process at a minimum.
Of deals that are serious, they're researched, they're both represented by good consultants, good counsel. There's a genuine good faith to complete a deal. From a business perspective, what percentage do you think get accomplished in 2024?
Yeah, I would say most of them. Here's the issue. You'll hear people say, I saw this from a pundit somewhere that said, we need to change the bank M&A laws because none of the deals ever get turned down. Every single application gets approved. And my comment on that was, well, that's because the ones that are not going to get approved, they don't submit them or they withdraw them. The regulators don't like to turn down an application, and the applicants don't like for it to be turned down. So what happens is you get a comment back from the regulators, you respond, you're trying to work it out, and the regulators just tell you, hey, I don't think this is a good deal. You might want to think about doing something else, which is a nice way of saying withdraw your application. But unless there is some major hiccup in it, our firm's personal experience is almost every single deal makes it through to closing. It's not without hurdles. It's not without unusual steps and circumstances, but it can get closed. But this is not every deal. This is the exception. But I've had some of those, even small deals, where the total time, start to finish, was closer to 2 years than 1. So I just think it's a different environment going into that. But if you don't have anything unusual, and candidly, if you're transparent with the regulators on the front end, if you do have concerns, bring that up, help them help you, let them help you, then all of those deals can get approved. You just have to have a little patience.
So the AOCI adjustment that you referenced earlier, with the Fed raising rates so aggressively, pushing the capital positions down in the community banks, is easing. Maybe the Fed cuts rates this year, maybe more next year. Maybe the Fed funds rate drops to 3% in 2 years, right? These AOCI adjustments kind of neutralize. Banks feel stronger. The buyers who want to be buyers have a little more juice in the tank and appetite to get deals done. What does that do to the regulatory environment and the regulatory approval timeline and process?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm knocking on wood here. I hope all that happens, right? Because it should ease a little bit of that uncertainty pressure around the AOCI issue, and interest rates are better. If you're going to borrow money, the financing of it's a little easier. So all of that should enhance the M&A environment. I guess in a really strict sense, I would suggest that the regulators would tell you that doesn't do anything to us because we're still singularly focused on what we're focused on. But I think what would happen is that it would help on the front side of the transaction where you're trying to figure out the negotiations, you're trying to understand the AOCI, all those things. If we just simply return to normal on that, the front part to get from the initial introduction to getting an agreement signed would be quickened. Because really the regulatory process and all that's about the same amount of time. What's happened is that on the front end of the transactions, the parties are spending a lot of time on the analysis to figure out, what the AOCI is, how do we structure the deal, who's bearing the cost of that, those kind of things. And I'll give you an example. We've had a couple of deals where, the proverbial mergers of equals, which don't exist, as I said, but where two banks say, we want to come together and we want it to be stock for stock. And so you would assume, well, the larger bank's the buyer, the smaller bank's the seller. But when you're considering AOCI, it could matter which one is. And you're thinking about the combined organization. So it may be that for accounting purposes and the like, the smaller bank would need to be the buyer, yet the bigger bank's name and all would survive. So there's a lot of those kind of issues that can be worked around. But because of AOCI and the interest rate factor, we're having to really double analyze everything on the front end to figure those kinds of things out. That's what's taking it longer. So I think if we had some of this good news with a somewhat return to normal, I think it would shorten the overall time. I'm not certain it would necessarily shorten the regulatory aspect, but the whole process in general would be shortened.
If there was one item that derails deals, what would you point to?
Good question. One item that derails deals. You're going to be surprised at my answer here because it's not going to be the financial part. That's numbers. You can work around that. It's almost always, particularly at a community bank level, the non-cash issues, the social issues. Man, this is a great opportunity, and we're so happy that our chairman and our president are going to be running it. Well, wait a minute. What are you talking about? I thought my president's going to be running it. Well, no, we're buying you. He's going to be a number two guy. Those kind of soft issues that you don't get resolved on the front end, even if they're small things. I've had deals fall apart over how many directors we're going to have of the combined organization. I've had deals kind of fall apart over, well, I know you're going to buy us, but will you still sponsor the Little League baseball team and the sign in left field? Well, no, we don't like baseball. So you have to sort out those soft issues a bit on the front end. Those are as likely to kill a deal as anything. It's really not the financial issues because the banks can sort through and work through the financial issues on the front end.
Blessed are the peacemakers, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Any advice for any bankers that would be going into this to navigate some of those soft issues?
Well, I think the idea is to not be afraid to discuss those on the front end. You sit down. If I have a client that's going in to talk to someone else as either a buyer or a seller, and there's like, hey, we had this discussion with other people, we're going to sit down and talk. The number one piece of advice I give them for the first meeting is don't talk price. We can figure that out later. This ought to be, does this work for both parties? What do you really want? I mean, and if it's a soft thing like a bank that's selling that says, look, we've decided to sell, but I'm going to tell you the one thing I want. My son needs a job. So I'm going to require it as a condition of the deal that my son's employed for 5 years. That's small bank discussion, right? Hey, I'd love for us to come together, but I want you to agree to keep my charter in existence for 3 years. Wow, okay. So the financial stuff, again, and as I jokingly say, it's just, numbers on paper. We can figure that out. But on these initial issues, get these soft issues up front. And if you say, well, I guess I never really thought about that, sit down and think about that. That's part of the planning process too. What do we really want as a buyer? What do we really want as a seller? And again, I've had buyers, for example, say, okay, I hear that you want to keep your charter. However, given the inefficiencies that creates, if we choose to do that, our number will be lower than what it is. Are you willing to take a lower number to keep your charter? So I think it's important just to get them all out on the table on the front end.
That's good. And to lead with those cultural issues, those soft issues, requires a patience and a confidence that if it's not a fit, we'll walk away. And I think in order to have that approach, you have to have thoughtfulness. You have to have advance notice. This can't be, we're running down to the wire, our CEO is retiring next year, and we're fearful because we can't replace that person.
Yeah, and your comment suggests that maybe, Mike, you've seen that happen before, as I have, right? It's just kind of sale by, emergency. And wow, we didn't really, I didn't know he was going to retire this quickly. What do we do? And then here we go. So again, a thoughtful process for that, a part of annual strategic planning. And again, mapping out what you want. Sellers in particular do not lose negotiating leverage, particularly if you're selling from a standpoint of it's just strategically the right thing to do, not because your back's against the wall from a regulatory standpoint or something else. So take the time to talk about all the issues, financial and soft issues.
So being transparent, honest with what's really important to you, I think it's interesting. It says that you said does not reduce the seller's leverage. If all things considered equal, it's a healthy, strong bank. Just being honest and upfront shortens the process and gets to a successful outcome, or dismisses it and saves everybody time and money. Either way.
I always find it interesting when you get the question about, well, hey, if we're going to sell our bank, you think we should tell them about whatever, fill in the blank, and you say, well, I don't know, why would you not want to tell them that? Well, because they might not buy us. Well, then that's a disclosure item you definitely need to disclose, right? You don't want to find that out way down the road. It's the same thing with, a regulatory application. Do we have to include that? Well, if you're asking, the answer is probably yes. So, there's no secrets in banking. You're not going to sell your bank and keep some secret that you've got. You have to disclose things. And if you got smart counsel on either side, you're going to have that written in the agreement that says, hey, if there's something material you didn't tell us, that's a breach of the agreement, and I'll decide if I want to stay in or not. So you're not going to surprise anybody. You're not going to get away with anything. It's full transparency on the front end. And then most deals now, not only do you do that, you're required to supplement what you've said up until the point of closing. So you're better off just being candid on the front end. And savvy buyers are comfortable making an acquisition of something that has a few blemishes on it, right? There's no pristine organizations. So the fact that, wow, you had a fraud a couple of years ago, you have some regulatory issues, that's okay. We're bankers too. So let's just talk about those. Let me see how deep that problem is. It might not make me go away at all. I might be glad that you said that, or you might say, I just got to admit we had a big CRA problem. Great. That's our strong suit. Our acquisition will clear up the problem. Oh, okay. Well, great. So I do like the idea of just forthrightness, honesty, transparency.
Absolutely. And we can just have those discussions. We work through them rather than hide from them. That's a great point. I think a lot of times, though, bank leadership, bank boards, there's a perception of financial savviness that sometimes can lead to a pridefulness. And I don't want to look vulnerable. I don't want to enter into those negotiations because you might find something that you don't like. But to your point, we've got to have confidence in the process. We've got to put it out there because it's going to come up at some point. But we see it sometimes where it's just ping pong back and forth, attorneys to attorneys. If we could just get some common language, some commonsensical discussion, get people in the same room, we can work through these things if we'll be honest and forthright together.
Yeah, and I hate to, for my own personal benefit and to the detriment of other lawyers, but there's a lot that can be accomplished by getting the lawyers out of the way and occasionally just saying, rather than us going back and forth and talking to our clients, why don't you two guys get in a room and figure that out? That's not really a legal issue. We don't particularly care. If you guys can decide who's going to do what, whatever. So, and maybe if you want the counsel there to help facilitate that, but a lot of times, and again, particularly in community bank deals, it's okay to have the clients talk to each other and at least reach a tentative agreement and then discuss that with their respective counsel to make sure there's no legal issue behind that. So that can really expedite things. So I agree with that.
Yeah, great. Thank you. One more question for you, Philip. Any final tips or advice for community banks exploring strategic options like mergers and acquisitions? one last call for final tips if they're considering this.
Well, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't say get good advice, of course, right? Self-serving. But I think the issue these days is, regardless of which side you're on, buy or sell, you have to go into it with a holistic approach, is the way I would say, meaning that absolutely price is a key factor, but it may not be the key factor. I'm also looking at this concern now over this technical AOCI issue. I'm also concerned, if I'm a seller, what does the buyer do for my employees, for my communities, for my customers? If I'm a buyer, yes, I'm buying core deposits, but do they really have a strong culture that blends with mine? Or if I'm doing all these nice things and bringing their employees over, are the cultures so crazy that the long-term effects of the organization are not going to be good? So my sort of last piece of overall advice is approach things holistically, not in a vacuum where you're only looking at one metric to make a decision on. You've got to look at the entire package of either what you're selling or of what you're buying.
Philip, what's the best way for our listeners to learn more about you and your firm?
Sure. They could contact us, through our website, which is www.gerrish.com, GERRISH. We also publish monthly newsletters that are free of charge. You can get on the email list there. You can just email me directly and get copies of those if you'd like those. My email address is psmith, PSMITH, @gerrish.com. And of course, they can contact me directly by phone if you choose to.
Philip, thank you for being with us. We really appreciate it. We know that you're very busy. Your time is valuable, so we appreciate you sharing some of that time with us.
Thanks, Mike.
It's been great having you. On behalf of all of us at Midwestern Securities and Banking on Growth, we want to thank our followers for joining and look forward to seeing you on this next version of Banking on Growth. Thank you.
This has been another insightful journey with Banking on Growth with Michael Graham and Midwestern Securities, a member of FINRA and SIPC. We appreciate your time. If you found value in today's discussion, consider subscribing for more thought-provoking discussions in the world of finance. Your support helps us continue to bring you quality insights. If you have a topic you'd like us to consider covering or have thoughts on one of our episodes, we'd love to hear it. Just email us at media@midwesternsecurities.com. Remember, the power to grow is within you. Thank you for being a part of the Midwestern Securities community. Until next time, stay inspired and keep banking on growth.